Okay. Okay, so yeah, dobrodošli. Hello, welcome. We'll start. Academics are usually not punctual, but we will be close to that today for this event. Welcome to the Ljubljana Lecture 2021. This is an event organized within the international conference celebrating 60 years of IR in Slovenia. A warm welcome to all of you here at the Grand Hall of the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ljubljana. There's about 70, 80 people here. Welcome. And since this is a hybrid event, we also welcome, I don't know where to look, probably into the camera. So all of the guests with us, who are with us remotely via the video conference. Obviously, I extend the most warm welcome to the main participants of this Ljubljana Lecture 2021, Professor Stefano Guzzini, the keynote speaker, and 3 scholars who are with us via video conference, and they will be delivering interventions upon the keynote. These are Regius Professor Kristian Skrede Gleditsch, Professor Beate Jahn, and Associate Professor Xymena Kurowska. I am Anna Bojinović Fenko, Associate Professor of IR here in Ljubljana, and I am moderating this event. This is the first academic event of the festive weekend for Slovenian IR, and we intend to get the party started in the best way possible that academics know, so with excellent speakers and thought-provoking debate. Our aim is to motivate conference participants of all backgrounds. We have here researchers, teachers, and students, to engage in the IR scientific reflection and conversation. We start with the Ljubljana Lecture, which is an institution we have created a couple of years ago to promote the quality teaching of IR in Slovenia. We have started this institution with Professor Guzzini, and we continue today with him and his contribution. A short introduction of a keynote speaker is in order. Although I have to say short is a rather big challenge for introducing an academic that has actually become, I would say, an institution of quality research, specifically theorizing IR, an institution of internationalized teaching, and also legitimate leadership in our epistemic community. So I will give it a try. Professor Stefano Guzzini is affiliated in Sweden at Uppsala University and also teaches at PUC in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's also senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. He was a teacher at Central European University in Budapest. He's also permanently guest lecturing in Ljubljana. He is currently co-editor of International Theory, a journal of international politics, law, and philosophy. He was editor of JIRD, Journal of International Relations and Development. And during his mandate, this journal was, in terms of quality, elevated to the level of Social Science Citation Index. He is co-editor of SAGE's book series in the Foundations of International Relations. He has mentored several PhD students very successfully that are now, some of them lead researchers, authors in the field. And he was up to 2019 president of Central and East European International Studies Association. So he is and has been very close to the region. And this is also some sort of one of the main reasons he's our keynote speaker. The title he's proposing is Being a Stranger, or the Role of the Academic Semi-Periphery in International Relations. I think our attention is very high, Professor Guzzini, and yeah, the floor is yours.
How many glasses and have experienced the exact same.
Here, here.
It always gets into the glasses. So thanks very much for the invitation, for the very kind invitation, which is really an honor to be here at that particular point in time. I hope, I'm told I should take it off for you to better hear me. I hope I will somewhat merit the expectation that you have put in me and also in this keynote speech, but it is first of all for me a great honor to be back and a pleasure to be in a place which I have visited over the last 20 years a number of times, teaching perhaps some of you in the room. So thanks again for this, and it's a memorable event for the region. I like that we still use that expression, the region. So dear colleagues, and most of all, dear students, being a stranger is the title of this talk, but before I get there, I need to do a detour. I would not be a professor if I wouldn't do that, right? So the first part is thinking about the times when I arrived at the Central European University in '94, and a little bit the experiences I had in my attempt or thought about how to move people from the region closer to what was the field of international relations, also the core of international relations, out of the periphery, so to speak. And I insisted very heavily that theory should be the way forward. So my first part is talking about theory and what the role of theory can be for moving out of the periphery. But in the second part, I will be slightly more modest, believing that maybe there are also strategies of making the best out of being in the semi-periphery and not trying to move and assimilate in every moment. Both strategies are perfectly fine, but I think there is a second one available. So the starting point is that I was teaching the classical way that you will be teaching coming out of graduate school. You bring all the stuff you have, you come into a field that hardly existed. I just taught everything which I thought was the normal canon of international relations. My trouble with that is that starting from new is actually a huge opportunity, but I didn't take that opportunity whatsoever because I just filled it up with a rule book that was already given beforehand. And the students were very courageous. They tried very hard to follow me in all these subtleties of the neo-realist, neoliberal debate, if there were any, or the intricacies of US foreign policy decision-making, since the field of foreign policy was so much dominated by what the Americans have been writing about it. They were very, very nice, trying to get into what I was talking about, but I needed so much contextualization, so much background to be provided so that it would speak to people, because it was basically far away and it was not necessarily touching their particular interest. So I was put before the difficulty to think both of an internationalized discipline that needs to be internationalized. I mean, it's international relations for that matter, right? But on the other hand, also not just providing one story that fits all. And yet, on the other hand, I needed also to make sure that we didn't just produce a kind of protectionist, autarkic national discipline in which the powers that be would be making sure that nobody else would be able to compete with them. Because where would we go when these savvy young kids would get a career by getting a reputation elsewhere, outside of the gatekeeping functions of whatever hierarchies there are? Well, if you don't like it here, then leave. Well, many did. So I needed to find something in between, and I thought theory was a privileged way to do so. Now, the first thing that you will tell, well, the guy is a theorist, so obviously he thinks that theory is very important, but maybe the more important question for me was, how did I become a theorist? Because I didn't start like that. My first course was on Kissinger. I did 3 years at Sciences Po, where you had a single course of theory among the, in total, I think 60 courses that I was going through. So theory was not exactly my exposure in the very beginning. Theory was something I needed to come to because I wanted to find some autonomy, coming from a small German provincial town where political science was abolished 10 years after I've left. So there is a moment in which I thought it was important for theory to come in because it provides an autonomy of international relations versus practical knowledge. And that will be my first point, because international relations is a very peculiar discipline. Most of the social sciences come into being because they have to deal with a new functional differentiation within societies. The economy relatively early, civil society a little bit later. And once the segmentation has taken place, also all of a sudden the state, which was usually the big thing that everyone was looking for, was shrunk into just being government. And so you got economics, sociology, political science, or most of the time it was actually called the science of the state, Staatswissenschaft, in many of the Northern European countries still until today, or in the old days, government, many departments of government. But international relations didn't function like that. It didn't start like that at all. Because whereas the other sciences had a new field that came up that had to look for new knowledge, we had already our field. Our differentiation had happened already beforehand. The mythological 1648 and sovereignty and the different states in which we get the territorial state division has happened well before that. So the effect was that whereas the other sciences needed to invent new knowledge to get a field going, we had already our knowledge for defining the discipline. So the discipline was not there to produce knowledge. Already existing knowledge produced its discipline. And that was practical knowledge. If you think about the first journals that were established in 1922 was the now called International Affairs done by Chatham House. In France, the Politique étrangère was done in the 30s, and the Revue de Défense Nationale in the 40s, but took off after 46. But these were all think tanks close to the policy field. Indeed, Défense Nationale was always edited by a general, and in its board there were always representatives of the ministries. So there's a very close connection between that which we were socialized 3 years at Sciences Po was a constant socialization into the diplomatic culture and the usual talk of practice. And I thought that this was not necessarily the right way to go. I mean, if the other ones had Marx, Smith, Ricardo, we should have something more than Metternich, Bismarck, and Gladstone, which were the things from which we would have to learn the practical lessons of history that would be the ones that would us making appropriate players in the international field. So IR was more than to be just a self-reflection of the practitioner. Because if it is just a self-reflection of the practitioner, then we have no individual life. They always know better, right? When academics come up with something which contradicts practical knowledge, we are told that we are wrong. And if we don't come up with something which contradicts it, we are redundant. There's no place for us. But we need more. We need to objectify basically that practical knowledge in itself. We need to have an observational position from which to do so. And that is very often achieved via theory, because theory gives you this observational level that is then to become something which is the backbone of an autonomy of a discipline, not in terms of a discipline compared to the other social sciences, but to the very peculiar setup in which practical knowledge plays such an important role in our own midst. The second reason I thought that theory was a very good idea was in the autonomy that it would provide us in the international division of academic labor. Because think about it, the core periphery metaphor to some extent works quite nice, not only because I've used it in the title. There are many instances in which big research projects will rely on local knowledge, language-specific knowledge that comes from different regions in the world, Central Eastern Europe being just one of them. But that means also that the software of the entire program is written by somebody else. The locals are just coding in the information that has already been basically set up for them by somebody else. And I think it is quite easy to understand that this is not necessarily a particularly good way of dealing with the international academia on the long run. You need to get out of this kind of dependency, and the only way to get out is to write the software yourself. But software writing is theory. That's the ones where you define what the actual problems are, the particular factors that need to be taken into account, the research problems that need to be made significant. And my hope in theory was also given by the fact that whereas money was quite unequally distributed around, but brain power is very equally distributed around the world. There's no reason to believe that because you come from a tiny German city or from wherever else in Central Eastern Europe, you would not have the same capacities as people who have been born in London or Washington and so on. So that was my hope, and the hope was actually, there was some good news in 2001 when I published an article on this in the Journal of International Relations Development before I became editor, on the role and significance of theory, because in the 90s we had seen a sudden rise of new spheres of IR in continental Europe, because continental Europe was just as much a semi-periphery to the English and American environment. We went to our conferences, which meant that we went to English-speaking countries. But then it changed. 92, the standing group, and Bojko was important in the standing group, made its first conference in Heidelberg, and these conferences have become important. The European Journal of International Relations is in 95. In international political economy, we got a relatively more, how can I say, political economy touch to it compared to the International Organization, the big journal in the US, by having the Review of International Political Economy and New Political Economy done, yes, out of the UK, but with much more of a European touch to it. The Germans got that Zeitschrift für internationale Beziehungen, all of that in the 90s. And indeed, the Journal of International Relations and Development that developed out of a merger in 1908. And it all were quite theoretical pieces in the very beginning, and all of them made an impact because it was moving something onto the cognitive map, which has basically not been very present beforehand. And so I was somewhat optimistic that this, if it could happen in Western Europe, it might also happen in Central Eastern Europe. Well, at the end of the day, I'm not so sure it actually happened all over Western Europe, and I think there might be problems for it to happen also in Central Eastern Europe. There might be no way out of the periphery, at least for many. One is that it has become very expensive. If you want to do theory, there can be two general traditions. One is based on empirical generalizations and trying to find the regularities of this world. And for this, there have been many databases built up. I mean, Kristian will probably talk about this at some point in time because his father was one of the main pushers at PRIO for building up a very important database, which certainly moved that part of European IR out of the periphery. But it's a cost-intensive, it's a money-intensive enterprise. Research councils need to provide loads of money for this. It is there's a critical mass of scholars which are educated through it. And it's a very good strategy, nothing to say about it, but it's not such an easy strategy necessary to be followed. And okay, then you can say you might do the other kind of science, which is, or theory, which is about frameworks of analysis. It's about the analytical lenses, the conditions for the possibility of knowledge and so on. But also here, in the more critical environment, the debates are decided in London or anywhere else, but in the center, not necessarily following what is going on here. So I was under the impression that, yes, brain power was more equally distributed, but money could co-opt brain power. And yes, brain power could also try to make its stance, but it was already given the debates within which it could make these critical interventions in the first place. And again, Central Eastern Europe is not alone in this. In fact, the majority of countries in the world are in that situation. So what to do? Become a stranger. So if a strategy of either protectionism and assimilation, on the other hand, protectionism and assimilation doesn't work, why not trying to define something more positive out of this position of being in the semi-periphery? Why not turning the whole thing around? Rather than seeing this a lack, define it positively as something that others might not necessarily have to the same extent. The stranger is a sociological term that Georg Simmel has introduced long time ago, and it's about the following position. You're not a foreigner. You're a stranger. That means that you're both inside and outside at the same time. He was thinking mainly about Jewish minorities across Europe who would be close to whatever home community they are, and yet never completely integrated into the home community. They would be close enough to understand very well what is going on around them, yet without necessarily being considered part or home of them. It's a position which is a position which puts you always on alert, because that what we take for granted when we are part of our communities is never taken for granted, because you always have already the objectifying gaze of the other community to which you also belong. It's, in modern talk, maybe people would call this very often hybridity, that you are more than one at the same time, which is an identity position actually all of us really share, but not necessarily that consciously. And so if there is no common sense that is taken for granted, the stranger is this very acute and sensible observer who can both step in and step out at the same time when doing his or her observation. And I quote Alfred Schutz. In other words, the cultural pattern of the approached group is to the stranger, not a shelter, but a field of adventure. Not a matter of course, but a questionable topic of investigation. Not an instrument for disentangling problematic situations, but the problematic situation itself and one hard to master. So being a stranger then is no longer just a statement of fact. It is a task or a vocation. And I think one needs to be stranger both abroad and at home. A stranger abroad is the one who tries to translate from the semi-periphery. We are already in the field, but we come with other things that we might be interested in, but other traditions in which we might be interested in. Any discipline is, of course, in some sense universal. We have common debates, common references, common concepts. And if you come out of practical knowledge, these have been reproduced via European international society and challenged quite heavily, not just recently, in that international society. But at the same time, we come with a certain local baggage. That can be, for instance, already the way that our languages are constructed. I don't know how many times you have been struggling with writing in English. I mean, I'm not a native speaker myself. The Germans have a very different way of writing their sentences. It's a synthetic way, not a sequential, analytical way. We write lots in passive voice, and we are told that passive voice doesn't fit the English language. But it's not an argument, right? The passive voice might need to express something which otherwise you can't express. So this very individualist setup that comes with this very active language that we are entitled, or that we are prompted to use, might not necessarily correspond to some of the traditions, cultural backgrounds from which we come. Not that we can't translate them, not that we cannot bring them in. We can, but they're different. And that difference is the starting point for making it. So it is in some sense a capacity to build the bridges between that what we experience and that what others do. I give you a last example because it's a typical one for international relations. I mean, all the students will of course have gone through these classes of realism, liberalism, constructivism, and all the isms, the paradigms that we have to learn. Now, it can be boring like hell, but the idea about learning these paradigms is actually something which I find very, very enticing. Namely, you learn different languages. You have to learn to put yourself into the position of somebody who is actually thinking quite different from yourself. So we are, from our education, meant to learn to translate from one to the other, to mediate that pluralism and diversity that constitutes international relations, rather than thinking that there's one single thing that can be applied one-to-one fits all to the world. So these paradigms, as useful as they are and as abused as sometimes as they are as well, can be a quite interesting starting point for learning these translations, which are particularly, I think, important in a field like international relations, which has to start from the irreducible diversity and pluralism of the world around us. But then that means that one should become a curious translator by mobilizing different resources and trying to reach out to different audiences in which one produces that particular bridge. A bridge that is not necessarily thought of when you sit in the core, because all is taken for granted and your language is assumed to be the universal one. But you need also to be a stranger at home. And this has to do with the understandable defensive reaction. If you talk, yet nobody ever listens, well, at some point you stop talking, right? How easier it is to just tempt to stay at home. Because our knowledge in international relations might perhaps not be important for the discipline, but it might be important for the powers there are, i.e. for the political environment, the media environment, everyone who needs to have an expert that comes in and provides some scientific knowledge or whatever authority you can mobilize in order to make your particular points. But then we risk in losing the research autonomy again to the political field, following not the questions of our research curiosity, but of political expediency. Worse, there is the risk of getting engulfed in geopolitical narratives. And by geopolitics, I mean the most nationalist theory we have in international relations. And geopolitics doesn't sound like that, right? It sounds very international, but actually it isn't. But it is one which is very easily mobilized in the practical knowledge, in particular if that practical knowledge is mobilized in an environment that is self-victimizing. We are weak, nobody is listening to us. Geopolitics is, according to me, defined by 4 things. First, it assumes that the world is a totality, that anything which happens in one place of the world will have ricochets in other places of the world. The second is that the world is finite. There is no way that you can export any of the conflicts as the European imperial powers thought until the 19th century, somewhat late in the 19th century. Third is that if it's finite, there's a sense that resources will not be sufficient for everyone. There's a Malthusian thinking that resources as compared to demography or whatever else are limited. And fourth, the almost logical consequence, therefore, is that the default position of international relations is a social Darwinist struggle for survival. There's the cake doesn't get bigger, we are more, we want more of it. And it's a very classical fallback for thinking in international affairs because it's so determinist, it helps you to write wonderful statements, but it's a very nationalist and very inward looking and would make exactly the kind of translation that I'm interested in when trying to find a specific place for the semi-periphery impossible, because the only thing we think about is ourselves. So I come to my conclusion. Of course, not everyone should become a stranger. I mean, at the end of the day, I moved, right? I did what many people did. I went elsewhere. But if you are in a position where you feel like one, perhaps there is a way of turning it around into a blessing. And you would do a favor to the discipline, not just to yourself. This said, it's a quite heroic appeal, right? So here you are, stuck, be happy. Sounds a bit easy, right? And it's also a quite lonely one, because it's a very restless existence, and you have the sense of permanent homesickness, because there's actually no real home to return to. So you are a stranger, you are in there, and you should feel happy, as I said. And I take this, of course, from Albert Camus' idea of the myth of Sisyphus, where he has the ending of his myth of Sisyphus, where he thinks Sisyphus rolling up that stone, being happy. And I first always thought this was, I understood why he got there, but this was far too heroic and far too elitist. How many people would be able to stand this frustration of just pushing up that stone time and again and feel on top of it, happy about it? But I think I might have misunderstood in the first reading his idea, because the idea is that you should enjoy the process. So don't pretend that you are at the top, and don't feel hapless at the bottom because nothing is making any sense and so on, but engage, try it. And the interesting thing I think about the stranger is that it is much less lonely exercise than poor Sisyphus, who was put there by the gods to do that on his own for whatever he had done beforehand. Strangers are all around. We can do in all of that together. And that's the point where I think Ljubljana comes in again. Because I think, I cannot speak for the department for the last 60 years, having been there only in touch with it for the last 20. But in these last 20 years, this department, or the practices coming out also of this department, have provided a space for these strangers to meet. I mean, some of the conferences were organized here, which were WISC conferences, so of the entire world. We had CISA and ISA common conferences organized here. We have the journal, which has become the second most important journal on the European continent in international relations. There's, I think, for me, no doubt about this. And if you look at the issues of that journal, it's a very peculiar one. It's from all over the place sometimes. There is nothing which is, so speak, a clean vision. And you can get Karen Gentry writing on Catholicism and feminism, and that would be in the Journal of International Relations and Development, because it's such an open place in which we do the translations. And so for these last 20 years, Ljubljana has been one of the major spots of making life for all these strangers more livable. And yeah, it's a little bit cheesy, but I think I should end with making the remark that it is the place that has making it possible that strangers of the world unite. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm kind of speechless, but that's okay, because I'm just passing the word towards the people who are supposed to comment right now. And I will maybe reflect on this in the second round. So we're moving to interventions. We have 3 colleagues with us online who will intervene upon the excellent, thought-provoking, and also well-personalized, I would say, keynote speech, just for the flow of the event. There will be 2 rounds of interventions, short responses, or let's say some sort of conversation between the 4 guest speakers. And in the end, we have reserved about 10 to 15 minutes also for audience questions, comments. So you will get the opportunity to interact. The first intervention will be given by renowned IR scholar, Professor Beate Jahn. She's head of the Department of International Relations at University of Sussex in Brighton. Besides, obviously, her rich academic CV with extensive list of highly cited publications, she has held prominent positions in the IR community. Specifically, she's been editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Relations, the first most important journal on the continent, from 2013 to 17. And she has just finished now in September, passing on her mandate of ASA president, so European International Studies Association president. So Professor Jahn, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this event. It actually is an honor, especially since I'm not the president of ASA anymore. But I'm really happy about this. You may have seen that I've just dropped out a few minutes ago. This occasionally happens with my internet connection. I hope it doesn't happen in the next 5 minutes, but if it does, it usually sort of corrects itself again. Okay. So I was desperately scouring Stefano's draft comments for something to disagree with. Not because I want to disagree with Stefano, but because, you know, mapping out alternative positions tends to make for some good discussion. Alas, I could not really find anything to seriously disagree with. Moreover, I think that Stefano's metaphor of the role of translator or stranger for the semi-periphery is really, really well chosen. So what I'm going to do instead is to pick up a few of Stefano's points and push sort of the boat out a little bit further. Basically, I want to argue, following Wallerstein and world systems theory, from which actually these terms, as technical terms, center, periphery, semi-periphery stem in international relations. So I want to argue with them that the place from which most innovative and progressive theorization comes is the semi-periphery. As Stefano says, theorizing is freedom. Yeah, writing the code ourselves is the emancipation from living by other people's codes. And more than that, I think if we don't learn how to write code, we won't even recognize the codes that we live by. So in that sense, I totally agree. But why am I saying that the semi-periphery is actually so conducive to doing that? Because it occupies the space between the center and the periphery. Both. It can speak both languages to some extent. But most importantly, it can see the tensions, contradictions, gaps. It can see the relationship between the center and the periphery, to which both of them are actually blind to some extent. But how then to do this? Stefano says the translator has to establish connections, and some of these connections are obvious. I would like to argue that the real mother lode of sort of theoretical innovation lies where there appear to be no connections whatsoever. We know ultimately everything hangs together. And if that is true in general, then it is of course even more true in international politics, yeah, which is a smaller field with things being more integrated. There can be no local, national, regional, no economic, social, cultural place that is not touched by international politics and vice versa. Or to put this differently, if the local was really local and not connected to international politics, then there would indeed be it would be irrelevant, and there would be absolutely no reason for people to engage with international politics, right? Basically, you wouldn't have an IR conference or discipline or whatever in all those local places, right? So if we can assume that that connection actually always exists, then it is precisely in those places where it is not obvious, where it is not clear, where it is not self-evident, that we must look for the relations that dominant theories hide, for the issues and problems that we don't see, because hegemonic theories do not provide the necessary concepts and lenses that allow us to grasp these issues. So throwing a light on these blind spots is, I think, the high road to innovative and progressive theorizing. And the semi-periphery is in the perfect position to engage in that kind of work, because it is estranged from both sides. It feels the disconnect, the not belonging to either, the frustration of being a stranger in either place. In the semi-periphery, the disconnect is alive. It's felt. One might almost say the semi-periphery is itself the connection that needs to be explored. So I think this is what Stefano means when he talks about sort of permanent homesickness. You know, there really is no home to go to. But it is the perfect position from which to embark on unprecedented intellectual adventures. This is, of course, neither easy nor comfortable, but I do think it can be quite exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jahn. We're just moving forward to the second intervention, which will be given by Regius Professor of Political Science, Kristian Skrede Gleditsch, from University of Essex, also affiliated as Research Associate at the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo, and Director of the Michael Nicholson Center for Conflict and Cooperation in the UK. Regius Skrede Gleditsch has acted as within the International Studies Association for the last decade, very actively as Vice President. He is currently the President of ISA. He also has experience of evaluating the quality of research of UK higher education institutions. So a very pertinent interlocutor. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to start by congratulating you on the 60th anniversary for the International Relations Research in Slovenia. And second, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this roundtable and respond to Stefano's very interesting lecture. In my commentary, I would like to try to do two things. First, I wanted to say a bit about the International Studies Association and the changes that we've seen in this organization towards greater internationalization, and some of the implications that I think this has for scholarship. And second, I'd like to offer some reflections on the topic of being a stranger or the semi-periphery in international relations by drawing on some comparisons with another region that I'm familiar with, namely Scandinavia. So the International Studies Association that I'm currently a president of is the largest international studies association in the world. It has about 7,000 members currently in over 100 countries, including, as I'm told, in Slovenia. Now, there are obviously many other professional societies that focus on international relations, but one of the unique features of the ISA is that it tries to be global in the organization and the scope of the organization. And it's had some success in being truly global. It currently has a membership base which is over 50% outside North America, or what we might think of as a core of IR scholarship, narrowly defined. But the ISA has not always been so global, and for a long time it was very dominated by North American scholars. In line with this roundtable, what we've seen is a move away from the core towards greater internationalization. Now, there are many reasons why this has happened, and I'm not going to try to cover this here. But in line with the theme, I'd like to say a bit about what I think follows from this, or how internationalization of an organization changes scholarship. Now, there are many sort of direct impacts, and Stefano talked about some of them. So if we have more people, we obviously have more brain power, and we have potentially larger research volume. But I think perhaps more interestingly, if you have a broader and more diverse membership, that also helps bring in new perspective to research and the events that an organization carries out. Traditionally, a lot of IR scholarship has been very dominated by US events and experiences. A lot of theorizing is puzzle-driven, and if you have theorizing around puzzles based on the experiences of core countries such as the US, you will get theories that will end up being very US-centered. I think this is quite noticeable if you look at theories of how domestic politics would influence conflict initiation, for example. Theories that are developed around the US are unlikely to be helpful for smaller countries that rarely participate in militarized conflict outside larger multilateral coalitions. But rather than just dismissing arguments that are US-specific, I think thinking constructively about the experiences of other countries could help identify other type of foreign policy responses that we might see in different systems. And then we could try to think constructively, more broadly, about what these may be cases of and how different experiences might fit into a more general theoretical perspective. And ultimately, we will have a much better understanding than if we start with specific examples and build theories around this. In addition to internationalization of research topics, we've also seen a lot of mobility across national boundaries. This panel is a good example of this. I think it has many participants who were born in one country and have either studied or worked in another. Now, in short, internationalization and globalization has clearly been very beneficial for our research. But that brings me to my second point, namely that different countries also have different backgrounds and different potential competences. So I wanted to reflect on some potential comparisons of Slovenia to Scandinavian countries. These are all relatively small, highly educated countries that in some ways punch above their weight in scholarship and influence. Since I'm more familiar with Scandinavia, or at least before this panel and conference, I'm going to say more about the former, but I hope that what I say might also have some influence on how we could think about Slovenia and other regions. So Scandinavian countries are small, but it's clear that they have come up with many different and very distinct contributions to our theory, even things that may now be labeled major traditions and schools. So in Norway, for instance, we've had the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, originally set up by Galtung, which was one of the first environments to pioneer formal mathematical approaches to peace research and developing the concept of positive peace beyond just an absence of violence. And in Denmark, the so-called Copenhagen School has introduced the notion of securitization, the importance of speech acts in understanding international relations, and also developed further the idea of regional security complexes. These are very different traditions, but are there any common elements that we can highlight as key to their success? I think there clearly are a couple of common and important elements. The first one is that they all involve collaborative groups beyond just a single individual. So we can do more and we can have greater influence if we pool our efforts together and work in larger collaborative groups. Second, I think that teams have been successful because they build on their own strengths. In some ways, they've done well because they identified and exploited their comparative advantage in what they could contribute to international relations research. And third, I think all these schools have been characterized by openness and extensive external collaboration, both from scholars outside the specific countries, as well as insights from different disciplines. It would be hard to think of the Copenhagen School without thinking about contributions from scholars outside Denmark, such as Barry Busan and Jacques de Wilde. And PRIO always had English as a working language and has had extensive international collaboration throughout the institute. Fourth, I think that these schools have been influential in part because they made very concerted efforts to engage internationally beyond their own communities. They've attracted extremely high prominence in international publishing, in part because they were willing to go beyond what I call the path of publication by least resistance. So what I take from this is that the semi-periphery has much to contribute. There clearly are segmentation and hierarchies in international relations research too, but I think they're probably easier to break down than many others, and that there are many opportunities for superseding these hierarchies in international relations research. Now, it's difficult to predict, especially about the future, but if I was a betting man, my money would be that a lot of innovations in IR theory is likely to come from outside the core. And I think they're likely to arise from a combination of strengthening local capacity and greater integration in truly global international relations research. And on that note, I conclude, and I thank again for the invitation to participate in this roundtable.
Thank you very much, Regis Skrede Gleditsch. And we are now moving to the third colleague who is giving the intervention on the keynote speech. This is Associate Professor Xymena Kurowska from the Department of International Relations at Central European University. She is currently holding a position of editorship together with colleague Sascha Stakovic from University of Vienna of the Journal of International Relations and Development, or JIRD, which has been mentioned several times today. Also in the first event, for those who were able to follow in Slovene the inaugurative event. This is a flagship journal of Central and East European International Studies Association, very close to Ljubljana. Obviously, it has come out of Ljubljana Research Center and has become internationalized. Also, it has very much use the junior scholars from Ljubljana for managing editorial people, so that is relevant, and very much socialization opportunity. This is how Stefano and myself have actually met as co-workers. So yes, from this position of holding this prominent editorialship, please, Associate Professor Kurowska, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am very honored, but I'm also very moved. And as we kind of continued our conversation, it's been more and more moving, so to say, starting with Stefano's talk. So I have to say that I will be speaking from this position. And I have to first say that it's quite amazing how indeed Stefano manages to be in his interventions always normative, pragmatic, and existential at the same time. I think this is a sort of already an example of being a translator. Another major thing that I will signal at the start is that in this proposition of the translator, I see the shift from away from the self. And I think that's kind of a major major proposition that we can theorize or not, but it is a pragmatic normative position that it is worth exploring. And the third, I would like to suggest that perhaps this position of a translator from semi-periphery is also a position of mature dissidence. And as such, it is extremely difficult to achieve, as much as we might be speaking in favor and wanting it and seeing its worth at the kind of psychosocial level, if I may. It is one of the most difficult positions to achieve. Before I offer a few remarks about my reading or retelling of Stefano's intervention, I do have to provide a contextualization or a caveat in terms of where I sit as a Central Eastern European subject and an IR theorist, and how I approached this moment. I studied for my MA in international relations at Warsaw University at late 90s, early 2000s, and that was an utterly atheoretical education. Atheoretical in IR terms. So perhaps I would be a typical student that Stefano met at Central European University later on. But from this atheoretical atheoretical space, I still came with quite a lot of formative experience in sociology and philosophy, and perhaps international law as well, which was a typical kind of higher education in Poland back then. And then I went on to study with Fritz Kratochwil, IR theorist, who has a very particular love-hate relationship with theory, I would say. And this is, I think, what he also instills in students. So I still do not understand any or the full range of subtleties of neo-neo debate, because I never learned it. And the first moment I really learned isms systematically was when I had to teach them to CEU students. So this is kind of my IR theory position, I have to say. And on theory can set you free. I agree with Stefano, and Stefano put it better with reference to the historical project of setting up IR in Central and Eastern Europe. Theory can make one autonomous from the immediate and structural, intellectual, political, ideological constraints, because theory gives, I would say, imagination, allows plurality, allows intimate distance, if I may put it like this, and problematizes. I concur with all this, but I will perhaps qualify that theory can only do that if one can use it. And can here does not refer to any cognitive or technical operational ability, but to something else. One can use theory if, I am putting this very crudely, one is not determined by it, one is not imprisoned by it, either in terms of structural conditions or psychosocially, again, at the level of the subjectivity. That is, theory as autonomy works best when one is already free. And this is the sort of a catch-22 that I think in the region, if I may, we might be facing. So Stefano, in his written remarks in particular, I think at least intimated that at least in terms of structural conditions, material structural conditions, Central Eastern European IR never really had a chance for emancipation. Neither before, nor particularly now, in the times of neoliberalization, where money determines so much, and there is actually little money, and that's the point of it, that there is little money, so that we have to chase it. So the proposition to become a stranger is, as I hear it, as we have already talked about it, is to emancipate oneself differently, to reconcile with the condition of semi-periphery by using it productively, by working at the midst of it pragmatically, without hypervalorizing this position actually, or demonizing or disavowing it, without perhaps, if I may put it like this, without decolonizing Central and Eastern Europe, but also by distancing oneself from the so-called Europeanization as prescription. And Stefano draws on Xymena, but with my Polish sensibility, so to say, I identify, or I kind of recognize quite a lot there from the practice of mature dissidents of the 19th century Poland under partition, to work organically at the grassroots, but also very important, and something that it is worth talking about, to let go of disappointment, or try to let go of disappointment, of despair, and most importantly of all, of resentment. And that is perhaps the point where we can start talking about shifting away from the self. Because this is perhaps genuine autonomy, to make use of one's contradictory identity without ironing its contradictions. It is still, I will say, a call for autonomy that we are ending up with, that few can afford. And here, perhaps in a bit jaded or dejected way, my question is, do we already need to be so strong to be so strong? How can we make ourselves strong this way to take this position of a stranger without sliding into ideological comforts of some sorts, including the stranger being a sort of ideological comfort? And the role of a translator is yet a more advanced position along these lines, because subaltern does indeed speak through translation. And this is where her major epistemological, political, normative advantage resides. And it is this, indeed, from this position of mature dissidence, I would like to say, that one develops ways of knowing that can handle more productively ambiguity and complexity. But this is the most difficult. I will end on this and give it back to Stefano. It is the most difficult position of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. Xymena, I will just call upon Stefano to maybe reply, comment directly on some of the questions that were posed, and then we go for the quick second round and to the audience, please.
This is difficult because the, is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I agree with all that has been said, and maybe the most profound issue is, of course, Xymena's at the end, in a sense that, and when I say it's a very lonely position to be, I think you are right. And I think the question that you ask is the right question to ask, namely how to achieve that moment of minimum autonomy to achieve the other autonomy of the translator afterwards. But I think, I hope it's a co-constitutive thing, something which works out through practice, as Kratok probably would have put it, something that comes into being by us trying to do so, and by meeting up with other people trying to do so as well. What Kristian was referring to, that you need research groups, and these research groups then afterwards link up to other places outside, is probably one of the potential strategies there is, if these other groups are sufficiently open-minded to accept you. There aren't that many, but there are around. And then one can play, as also Beate says, one can play out the advantage one has of feeling the disconnect time and again, but it's a difficult one. So when I say slightly, as I said, slightly cheesy, strangers of the world unite, I think that's part of. It's not just part of the strategy. There can't be any other strategy. It is in fact trying to have a kind of transnational net that is made possible through the associations perhaps, but also through personal networks, and to some extent by providing the field that the journal is also providing, and not only this, but certainly this journal is providing for doing so. It doesn't mean that we don't feel lonely or left alone, or that we will not have the resentment that people don't listen, or and so on. As Xymena said, she's moved, and I feel that with her, and I think there are many in the field who have felt that beforehand. But then we have no other. I see for the time being no other choice but to turn that into the advantage that also then Beate insisted upon. So thanks very much for these thoughts, which yeah, tell me that I might need more than my conclusion for going forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you. When I was reflecting upon your keynote speech, Stefano, I also thought of myself being a stranger from, let's say, semi-periphery academically, and how I understood myself as an individual coming out to the international academic community, but also some sort of a member of community. So not just translator, but also ambassador of some sort. But then when you enter the world, you see there's different semi-peripheries, right? So how much can you then speak for everyone? Or where are you an individual per se, as you have to be, because you cannot hide around a collective identity. It is you yourself as an academic that is responsible for the production of knowledge. So I don't want to stay at this level, individual level of analysis of a member of community, but I want to take advantage of the 4 people who are here today with us, who had been leaders within the community. So how much can you take advantage, or how much are you constrained by a lead position, either journal editor, department, head of department, ISA president, ASA president, etc., from this perspective that you can individually actually contribute something. Thank you. All 4 of you, maybe in the same order, or maybe we go with the reverse order and Xymena starts. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
My name is actually not from the region, maybe from a different semi-periphery, actually. So that's why maybe it's never clear how to pronounce it. But just let me start also by saying a few words about Jahn, because it has popped up so much already. So whoever came up with that line about Jahn, a global journal with regional roots, really got it. I don't know who guys came up with it during the editorships at Ljubljana, because as Stefano also mentioned, the kind of pluralization that has happened through the journal, through its history, it's quite extraordinary. And yeah, this is not to our credit, we have just taken over, so it's all to the credit of previous editors. But you can indeed see in Jahn the kind of pluralism which is very rarely a practice, if I may put it like this. And our editorial bid around which I built the team was precisely about that. We do not have an editorial line, which of course it is a sort of agenda, but that was our kind of take. We do not have a line. We stay at the level of, or we remain a general IR journal, although this is actually not in sync with the individual trajectories and preferences of any of the editors. Because if you look at the editorial team, these are personalities who are embedded in very kind of specific critical, not critical, whatever you call it, but very specific agendas. So also a word on in connection with Stefano's proposition about a translator, I, of course, as the coordinator across the board, see the flow of submissions. And GEERD, if I may, I hope it's not very confidential to say, GEERD has the most submissions from Czech IR, German IR, and Global South. And in this, just looking at this sort of distribution, one can see how Ljubljana-based journal has pluralized international relations. I don't know what it is about Czech IR that they are so so fantastic, and maybe actually at the forefront of the translation from the region. How at the individual level, although I have spoken quite a lot from the individual level already, but as an editor, I do face very significant dilemmas. Now, whether my task is to help the journal or help the authors, and these are not contradictory, but sometimes they can be, because you are invested in building the journal as an institution, but the journal functions in a particular extremely neoliberal landscape of publishing, where you are invested perhaps more in visibility, more in kind of pushing certain indicators than not. But on the other hand, there is, of course, there are authors from the region, and how we cultivate pluralistic knowledge without, on the one hand, molding everyone to write in a certain way that we have otherwise learned, and on the other hand, how we kind of help shape papers in a way that they actually do foreground and bring in this pluralistic knowledge. Because one thing that we might be facing, and that I face on the daily basis in the editorial work, is that actually this pluralistic regional knowledge is not being brought in so much, because somehow it gets diluted through other scholarly investments. I'm not sure if I'm clear on that. What I want to say is that if we are, for instance, to think about this role of the translator, we could have more of this in terms of submissions. So that would be just my first thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Xymena, Kristian, you want to add?
Yes, before I became ISA president, I started out as an editor, and I think the role of an editor and the amount of work that you can invest in it has changed fundamentally over the last 2 decades. As Xymena said, there are some cases where you get submissions where you realize that this is a good idea, but if you send it out for review, it will probably not receive a warm reception, in part because of issues of presentation and so on. So then, as an editor, you have to think, should I invest in helping the author, or should I move on to the next stack? I've always tried to, especially when they're younger scholars, to look to see if you could help people express ideas. In many cases, this has helped convert a manuscript into a much stronger submission. Now, that was easier to do when journals had about 100 submissions per year, but most journals now are closer to the 1,000 mark than the 100 mark, and it becomes increasingly difficult for editors to invest this kind of time. So we face a paradox in that when we have a growing discipline, we also have sort of growing barriers to publishing, because we have a larger volume of submission, the reviewer pool is not growing at the same pace, acceptance rates are going down. So we're getting more diverse, but we might also get more narrow in that we have higher barriers to publishing. It's easy to identify the problem. It's much more difficult to think of constructive solutions. But I think eventually we will have to think about whether we could use the submission stage more constructively. Could we think of, for instance, having a system where different journals have a common submission system where we share reviews, we have revisions, and publication done sort of more sequentially. When we publish things online, the marginal cost of additional pages is not zero, but it should be much lower than for print. So there are things that we can do on submission and publication stage. But I also think that we should think more constructively about the post-publication stage. Peer review is a great institution, but we shouldn't think that something is true just because it's been through peer review. Peer review does not have magical powers in detecting what is correct and logical flaws. Currently, it's very difficult to publish any kind of comment on published research. So we should think about extending the discussion into the post-publication phase and provide more avenues for comments and extensions in a way that's currently kept out of journals.
Thank you. Post-publication phase, okay. Digitalization maybe enables that very well, right? Beate, you have also been a prominent editor, but also leader within the ESA. Can you comment some more on this opportunities?
Yes, I want to make a slightly different comment, which, however, pertains to both of these roles that I've had, and which is to some extent a follow-on from Xymena's entirely correct identification of, the difficulty of the semi-periphery. I think these difficulties also really entail the need to choose the battles you need to fight, right? And one of these battles that I think is often overlooked is the battle over national foreign policy, right? We often think about the exclusionary nature of IR theories, the lack of money, institutional, constraints, whatever, all those kinds of things. And this is all true and it's all important and so on. But when we, that is the Sussex team, took over EJR, we set out to broaden the readership and authorship of the journal. We wanted to take in the global south, the semi-periphery, everything, right? and to this end, of course, we looked at the data. And we looked at, where are actually the submissions coming from, where are they not coming from, and so on. So it turns out, you look at these data, that it is not the case that the whole of the global south is not represented, or that all of the global north is represented, or something like that. What actually happens is that you see that you get, for example, very good rates of submission and actually also publication from, say, Turkey and Brazil, right? Now, Turkey and Brazil, and in fact, better than, say, Israel or France, who would be, culturally and geopolitically sort of placed more towards the center. Also better than, much better than India, while the Indians would have a language advantage, right? But no, it didn't go that way. It was Turkey and Brazil. So we asked ourselves, why Turkey and Brazil? And what, the answer to this question has been that the national foreign policy governments and government aspirations were actually really important in this. So Turkey's goal for a long time, of course, has been EU membership. And to this end, Turkey was trying to sort of align itself with all kinds of, center issues. And so they had scholarships, regular scholarships for people to study in Europe. They had demands, European activities, publications, all kinds of things were sort of played a really important role for appointments to a job in Turkey itself, right? So you actually had to show that you had made that connection. Exactly the same thing happened in Brazil, right? We at Sussex, we used to have a steady stream of Brazilian PhD students who all came on the same government scholarship. And this is to do, of course, with Brazil's, national aspirations of playing on the global stage, BRICS and all of this. And, these policies, they are sort of positive in the sense that they bring these viewpoints into the Western thing, but the people also go back. Often these scholarships entail the need for them to go back, and they bring some of the Western stuff back. So you have this going on, but you also have the opposite situation. You can basically stop that process, yeah? So we have, of course, cases of this happening. Kasha's book shows how this is all stopped in the case of Russia when Russia decided that the EU was the enemy, and the same is true for Turkey and Brazil under the populist governments, who have basically decided that they are going to scrap all these programs and that their aspirations are now going elsewhere, not we become a member kind of thing. I want to mention one more example that is maybe sounding a little bit more unlikely, but it's also a little bit more personal. Germany, yeah? You would think it's unlikely because German IR scholars are widely publishing in European and American IR journals. They're represented at conferences and so on and so forth. But this was not always the case. When I studied in the 1980s, before the end of the Cold War, there were not a huge amount of IR programs at German universities, and the kind of IR we did was sort of a little bit of Kant and perpetual peace, coupled with counting tanks and missiles. To put it crudely, this reflected perfectly the needs of the German government to, on the one hand, atone for the Second World War and the Holocaust. So we were good people, who were doing norms and Kant and perpetual peace. And on the other hand, the fear, we'd be the battleground in the Third World War. So we're counting some missiles, right? So this all changed after reunification. And whether out of a need or a desire, anyway, the German government had to start playing a different role, had its full sovereignty, had to start playing a different role in world politics, and suddenly you get IR programs expanding, you get students interested in those programs, you get academics publishing in wider ranges of journals, you suddenly get a take-up of new theoretical approaches in Germany. There was no post-structuralism when I was around, absolutely none. We weren't allowed to read Hegel, okay? So why am I highlighting this dimension of the problem? Because I think it's actually often overlooked. We focus on these other things, and they are very important, but the smallness or poorness or whatever of different countries or locations are not necessarily, to my mind, the most important determining factor for what kinds of opportunities we have for people to, to move abroad, to bring things from abroad back home, to actually engage and mix and mingle. And it seems to me that identifying that sort of national foreign policy dimension is quite important, not only in terms of taking this into account, and no institution, no sort of ISA or JIRD or whatever can do anything about it, right? But scholars in those countries can, of course, influence those policies to some extent. And that, I think, is a very important part of the task.
Thank you, Beate. Well, as you all see, we are upholding the academic tradition that a good debate cannot finish on time. I take this as my responsibility. I'm the moderator. So, Stefano, can we agree that you try to, that you try to maybe comment or use some of the comments that you've prepared after we at least offer the option of a question, comment from the audience? I think we should do that. Since we promised in the beginning, and it's the convention, please do take opportunity. No?
can also just make an intervention saying it was great. It's good.
That's welcome. Okay, do you then want to wrap up as how great this was, Stefano?
Well, I think you got a lineup of editors, which of course then think about their role and the difficulties of that particular role. And I think, again, we probably mostly agree on the difficulties that we face, and the nurturing, so Kristian's point about whether you nurture a particular submission, which might not necessarily be at the forefront, at the forefront in terms of selling its point, that is a very difficult one. And I think that's one connected to the semi-periphery. I mean, Beate and I have been socialized through German schools, so we don't write like the Anglo-Americans tell us to write. I mean, there are these two crime stories comparisons. So maybe you have seen this series called Inspector Detective Columbo, where you have the murder at the very beginning. You know already the whole story, but you have to follow Columbo of how getting there. That's the Anglo-American way. The German way is Agatha Christie, where you build bit by bit by bit by bit the pieces together, and you have to wait until the very damn end when everything is pieced together in this gigantic synthesis in which everything makes sense, right, Beate? This is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis type of thing. Of course, an Anglo-American reader will probably drop off by page 2 because they want to have all the sign points posted at the beginning, like in a jury in which you're in front of in a court in front of a jury where you're making your points, whereas some of my French colleagues believe that this kind of writing is an insult to intellect, because you say what you want to say, you say it again, and you wrap up by saying it again. So we got it kind of thing. And it is quite hard, because when you get submissions out of a different tradition, you have to somewhat help getting there. So I think it's not the only journal, but International Theory has this revise before submit. So we are engaging the authors, trying to rewrite it in a certain manner so that by the next time they might be possibly have the chance to go through the referee process. But you can clearly see how expectations are really mainstreaming or narrowing, but also Xymena said, narrowing incredibly down. And we have not much of a choice, because the referees at the end of the day have sown so much time. So they will go through it according to the usual list. But there's one way in which one might help in building up this little autonomy. So I try to be present in many places. So I'm teaching regularly in Coimbra. I have been invited regularly in Ljubljana. I have been teaching in Lublin. I have had PhD workshops in Warsaw. I try actually to be present. So if students can't come to me because it's too expensive and they can't get the whatever selection. I was on the PhD committee in Uppsala. We had 300 applicants for 4 positions. So if you can't make it, then there's this other way in which we can go. And it is possible to meet and to find other strangers around when you're going outside. So one possibility, or what I find one of the most interesting ones, is indeed to learn by making these trips abroad. And I'm also quite privileged to have a position in Rio de Janeiro, which allows me every year also to get completely different worldviews from what I'm normally used to, and hopefully learning through them, because it's both ways that the story should go.
Okay, thank you, Stefano. I believe we have now come to the end of the session. Not to the end of the debate though, but session. The debate will continue. There is a very good chance that this conversation will see a publication in a form of a forum in JERT. You will be notified of that as participants of the conference. A sincere appreciation goes to our speakers, whom we cherish for their continuous contribution to the development of IR community, specifically in Central Eastern Europe and Ljubljana. The audience, you're welcome to continue and take part in the further conference program after the break today and then tomorrow and online. Thank you very much and see you soon.